In Victor Hugo's 1831 novel Notre Dame de Paris, a story better known now by its later English name, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, a central theme is the idea that the sun was setting on the Renaissance in 1482 when the book was set. That setting sun we mistake for a dawn, in the words of Claude Frollo. Later adaptations that you're more likely to be familiar with shifted the focus away from the building itself and towards the melodrama of the people who surrounded it, which you can even see in the way that the title was changed from a sole focus on the building to also include a character. Notre Dame was a big deal for Hugo, who believed that the invention of the printing press and the arrival of the novel had, in effect, signaled the death of the role of architecture as one of the common staples of communication and storytelling. All of this is neatly encompassed in another Frollo quote, Ceci, Tuera, Cela, or this will kill that. The novel will kill the edifice, and with it kill the romance of the Renaissance. To me, this is really interesting. I think I first heard about it in a Lindsay Ellis video essay, and it's stuck with me ever since. Hugo wasn't just invested in the architecture for architecture's sake. He wasn't one of those weird marble statue Twitter accounts going on and on about the fall of the West or whatever. He was specifically concerned with, and fascinated with, the transition. It wasn't just about the death of architecture as like a concept or as a lingua franca, and it wasn't just about the belief that the printing press had been purely negative. It was about something bigger than that. It was about what it meant to witness the passing of the baton from the old to the new, from the Renaissance to whatever might come next, and specifically what that meant in terms of culture and communication. It's not like there wasn't anything else going on where and when he lived that he could have written about to capture these sorts of concepts in broad terms. Like, he could have talked about modern political transitions or social transitions, given that he was living in Paris in the early 19th century. Like, to put his life into context a little bit here, Napoleon became first consul for life 6 months after he was born. The man lived in chaotic times, but he chose to focus on how we communicate with each other through a story set 350 years in the past to highlight Notre Dame, a building that had fallen into disrepair by the time that Hugo wrote about it. And he was using the medium that he was accusing of the murder to do so. Now, what does any of this have to do with Overwatch? Well, if you've followed any amount of Overwatch discourse over the last few years, you've undoubtedly come across one narrative that gets scattered throughout it all. The idea of the Overwatch killer, the game that will eventually supplant Overwatch's position in culture and in gaming. This hasn't always been the narrative around Overwatch, and of course not everyone agrees on whether or not Overwatch should be killed, but it is definitely more of a punching bag in recent years, and it's certainly not entirely undeserved. On top of that, there are also more and more good games that are coming out that fill a similar niche to Overwatch and feel like they could pose a real threat. All of this is genuinely fascinating discourse to me for a lot of reasons. I mean, obviously on the surface, I've played a lot of Overwatch, I've talked about it a lot, and a lot of my content has revolved around it. The death of Overwatch would inherently kind of impact me a fair bit. But it goes beyond that too. There's an impulse to write off the Overwatch killer narrative as just simple hater behavior, but to me it says something really interesting about how we approach media in general and video games specifically. And that's what I want to talk about today. Starting with Part 1. Ours not to reason why, ours but to do and die. One of the reasons I want to explore the topic is that, beyond the phenomenon itself being interesting to me on just like a surface level, I think there's also a lack of critical analysis of what it means for this sort of phenomenon to exist in the first place. Why do people care about this killing that? Why is Overwatch killer a label that people are eager to attach to games like Marvel Rivals or Deadlock? Why is it a label that matters at all? And why Overwatch specifically? The name of this section is a Tennyson quote from The Charge of the Light Brigade. It's often misquoted as do or die, but the whole point is that the Light Brigade was not meant to question their orders or their fate. They were meant to do as they were told and to die in the process. This discourse, to me, feels like it strikes a weirdly similar note. People don't ask why they cheer for or even against the Overwatch killers. I mean, if you asked why they believed Overwatch should die, they could definitely give you a handful of good reasons. You know, Blizzard's an awful company, there have been all these broken promises, egregious monetization practices, all that stuff. But that's not what I mean. It's not about why should Overwatch die. It's about why is the death of Overwatch an objective in the first place. The death of Overwatch is assumed to be something worth caring about. But is it? And if so, why? I also think we don't really explore what death means in this context when this discussion happens. Like, realistically, Overwatch is probably too big to straight up die, and most people aren't talking about Overwatch killers in the sense that they think that Marvel Rivals is going to cause Blizzard to just shut off all their servers. Death in this context is a more nebulous concept. The death of its cultural dominance and relevance more than some sort of like Concorde-esque wipeout. In Notre Dame de Paris, which, side note, going forward I'm just going to refer to the building as just Notre Dame and the novel as Notre Dame de Paris just for the sake of clarity, Hugo focused on the death of architecture at the hands of the novel because of what it signified about the changing of the cultural guard. What it would mean for humans on an individual and collective level to rely more on the written word than architecture as a common language for expression and storytelling. This wasn't just talking about architecture in the abstract or anything like that. Like, it's not talking about just like, oh, the beauty of these spires. Religious architecture in particular was often done in such a way to tell the stories of the faith through statues, art pieces, sculptures, and more. It was, very literally, environmental storytelling. They served as what has come to be called the poor man's Bible, a way of telling the story of the Bible to the poor and illiterate who could still read the stories through the walls, and a pretty valid concern of Hugo's was that the rise of the printing press had left a lot of those people behind. Literacy rates in France were relatively high compared to a lot of places at this point in time. They were at about 50% at the start of the century, hundreds of years after the printing press had been invented. And of those 50%, the wealthy, the elite, and the male were the ones who were typically disproportionately literate as a result of either the lack of access to education or the deliberate exclusion from it for people who didn't meet that criteria. While this wasn't as bad as it was in some parts of Europe, like Portugal, where it was still hovering around 30% literacy by the end of the 19th century, and France had managed to hit roughly 80% by that same point, that's still a huge number of people who were left out of the way in which stories were now being told, and the narratives of their own societies. Victor Hugo never said that people were gonna, stop building buildings, or that they wouldn't aspire to fancy, pretty architecture. His concern was that it would lose its status as a dominant cultural method of expression and communication, and that the attempts to recreate it in the centuries since then were often just empty facsimiles of what made Notre Dame matter. A sculpture was no longer being made to tell the story of Christ's death and resurrection. It might be an illustration of that story, but it is not telling that story. You're meant to go read that in the printed Bible. It's important to establish that he wasn't just like, oh no, we're not getting any more pretty buildings. And whether they mean to or not, I think the people who are fixated on the death of Overwatch are saying something similar, but in the opposite direction. Hugo bemoaned the death of architecture specifically in its role as a staple of culture, seeing it as a powerful tool for communication and that society had lost a lot in the move to the novel and the printing press. But the death of Overwatch isn't like that. People see it as a staple for sure, it's part of the discussion, it's one of those games that always gets brought up, but not necessarily in a positive way. Those people are exploring the death of Overwatch not in fear of what will replace it, but more honestly out of hope that something can. For those people, it's not about Ceci, Tuera, Cela, this will kill that. It's about Ceci devrait tuer Cela. This should kill that. Also, apologies for French pronunciation. I will continue doing it because I'm more afraid of French people getting mad at me for not trying than I am for Anglophones getting mad at me for trying. But anyways, that's interesting to me. I think it's a really interesting distinction that I think people are making here, at least subconsciously. Architecture didn't stop being a dominant communication medium of its own volition in Hugo's eyes. It faced the external threat of the printing press that pushed it out, the same way that the automobile pushed out the horse-drawn carriage. By contrast, Overwatch, in the eyes of the people who often talk about the death of Overwatch or the Overwatch killers, did stop being a useful part of the culture of its own volition. Its golden age came and went, and now people are actively trying to find the thing that'll kill it so they can move on. And while a lot of that comes from outside the Overwatch community, it comes from people who don't play it, who just want to hate, whatever, a lot of it's internal too. There are plenty of people who hype up the next Overwatch killer who are still playing Overwatch, and that is an interesting phenomenon. Gutenberg wasn't inventing the printing press because he hated architecture, and the people who adopted it weren't just doing so out of some spiteful desire that it would kill architecture either. But there are a surprising amount of people who play Overwatch who are eagerly looking for anything else to jump to that can scratch the same itch. And as we start to explore this, we start to get a picture of the reason why. Some of it's hater behavior, but some of it is that people also feel almost trapped by the game. Their friends are here, they know this game is popular enough to still get fast queues, whatever it is, they want something that does that, but manages to do it better. And this is especially true for content creators. A lot of Overwatch creators have jumped ship over the years to various other games, or just games in general, doing something different with their content, and whenever a new hero shooter comes around, still more jump. Over the course of 2024, I feel like Marvel Rivals and Deadlock have been the big challengers that have kind of taken the most people and gotten the most hype as Overwatch killers, but you also have stuff like Supervive that'll get mentioned to some degree as an Overwatch killer. Another thing that's notable about this kind of discourse is that this isn't how every game dies. For one, lots of games just fade. They just sort of go away over time. I don't think there's anything that you could point to as a singular Halo killer. It just kind of stopped being the game the way it once was. But there also weren't years of discourse pointing at every single sci-fi shooter that was coming up and holding it up as the Halo killer either, and I don't think you can point at just one game that stole its thunder. Tastes changed, culture changed, developers changed, and what people wanted changed, and that change just kind of, eventually, passively didn't include Halo the way it once did. In a lot of ways, this is sort of the natural progression of things. It's how most big games tend to go away. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. Halo's still around, obviously, there are still Halo games, but if you compare Halo today to Halo 20 years ago as a cultural phenomenon, it's obviously no contest. In contrast, some games do go out with a bang. For example, you have what happened with city builders in the early 2010s. SimCity had been the city builder game for years until 2013, when SimCity, which is, yes, just called SimCity, I guess it was a reboot, it should be called SimCity 5, whatever, doesn't matter. When SimCity came out as an always online nightmare release that straight up destroyed the franchise. This was a pretty rare instance of a game or a franchise not only straight up dying, but having a clear cause of death. And its death left a vacuum that, 2 years later, Paradox would eventually fill with City Skylines. City Skylines didn't, kill SimCity in that way. SimCity was basically already dead, but it did wrap the coffin in chains and chuck it into the ocean to make sure it couldn't come back. Without City Skylines, SimCity maybe eventually could have had a comeback a few years down the road, but ultimately this was a pretty clear transition. One dominant game died and another took over. This isn't the most common way for it to happen, I don't think, because usually, games don't get big enough to become dominant without being at least somewhat competently managed, or at least competently managed enough that they don't actively explode. But it does happen. Regardless, neither of those cases really saw the kind of cheering for the death of the franchise that we see with Overwatch. Nobody was cheering for SimCity to die prior to 2013 really, but that release was unquestionably going to kill it, and it deserved to die the death that it did. With Halo, there was certainly frustration with the direction 343 took the franchise and a desire for Bungie to recapture the magic of the early Halo games with Destiny or some other project, but most people didn't want Halo to die. But Overwatch is something different, for more reasons than one. Part 2. The Man Who Would Be King. Do you enjoy Kipling, Miss Scarlet?
Sure, I'll eat anything.
A big difference here is that the games in Overwatch's niche are titled as killers, not just competitors. Call of Duty has competitors. Fortnite has competitors. Overwatch has killers. Assassins come to slay the evil tyrant to free us all. And this creates a unique pressure on the games that do try and compete with it, because this turns it into an all or nothing situation. Either they successfully kill Overwatch and they win and they succeed and they are a good game, or they fail to kill it and thus fail at their purpose. It creates a higher standard as well. Whether you're pro or against the death of Overwatch, these games aren't being evaluated by just what they are, or by being successful in their own right. You can't just be a king, you must build an empire. Rudyard Kipling's The Man Who Would Be King is an 1888 story about two men who hatch a plan to become kings of Kafiristan after deciding India just wasn't right for them. They seek power for their own purposes and are initially successful. But then one of the men, Dravit, I don't care, gets a bit lost in the sauce as he moves from king to god and emperor. He tries to marry a Kafir girl, but she panics during the ceremony and bites him, causing him to bleed. And gods don't bleed. He was, as the story said, neither god nor devil but a man, and so the deception was revealed. Dravit is executed and his accomplice, Carnahan, is crucified. However, after Carnahan survives a day of crucifixion, they decide it must be a miracle and so cut him down and he makes his way back to India. There's obviously more to the story than that, not least of which are Kipling's, let's say, views on colonialism in general and the advantages and successes and merits of the British occupation of India more specifically. However, what I think is illustrative for our purposes here is the rise and fall of Dravit. He and Carnahan are both con men, and while their con is initially successful, it's largely a tale of hubris. Dravit took it too far, he got too hungry for power, and eventually bit off more than he could chew. Or rather, his bride-to-be bit off more than he could chew for him. That doesn't make any sense, let's move on. Carnahan, meanwhile, tried to advise him against what he was doing, particularly the marriage, but he was drowned out in the discussion. It's also not a coincidence that it was a girl who revealed the plot in all of this. It reflects another of Kipling's works, The Female of the Species, a poem about how, as the title and refrain say it, the female of the species must be deadlier than the male. Before you get the idea that this is like some girl boss endorsement, this was not a compliment to women in Kipling's eyes. This was instead more of a statement of Kipling's view that women are inherently vicious and stubborn to a dangerous extent because they need to be in order to protect their children, which is the only thing that he thought that women were good for. Anyways, the reason I bring this up isn't that this is a unique narrative. The hubris of the power-hungry man that eventually leads to his destruction is a pretty common story, whether it's The Man Who Would Be King, or House of Cards, or an Elon Musk autobiography in about 10 years if we're lucky. And it's not like hubris isn't already a pretty massive part of gaming, even just within the context of Overwatch killers specifically. And this is where I say I am so thankful for Concord's existence because I could not think of a better way to prove my point. Concord was Sony's attempt at an Overwatch competitor, a hero shooter that spent 8 years in development and had an estimated budget of around $100 million. Although, to be clear, that number is shaky at best and is very much so a guesstimate, before it released in August of 2024. You may notice I'm talking about this game in the past tense here because the game flopped so unbelievably hard that it got killed after less than 2 weeks, with full refunds being issued to the roughly 24,000 people who bought it. While it's fun to poke fun at Concord, gaming is regrettably full of a lot of these kinds of stories lately, and it's not a great sign for the industry that so many resources are being wasted and so much talent is being kicked out. There's going to be a real gap in knowledge coming in a few years, and we're all going to feel it. However, what I think is kind of notable about the Overwatch killers is that many of them aren't victims of their own hubris. They're not the Dravit or Dravit, I'm so sorry I don't know how to pronounce his name, I don't care, he sucks. Anyways, they're not the Dravit of their own story. NetEase, the developers of Marvel Rivals, aren't the ones calling their game Marvel's take on Overwatch or Marvel's Overwatch killer. The community and the public are, the same way that Deadlock has long been treated as if it's Valve's eventual Overwatch killer. These games are definitely competitors, don't get me wrong. Like, they're not one-to-one comparable with Overwatch, obviously, but they're still clearly in the same field. And they want to become kings, sure, but they're not the ones who say that that's not enough. NetEase and Valve aren't the ones saying they must be gods and emperors. That's coming from the outside. The fans who impose the Overwatch killer narrative on these games are the Dravits, the developers, as Carnahans. Both parties want the game to succeed, but the definitions of success aren't shared here necessarily. For the developers and the publishers, success is a profitable, sustainable game. For the people looking for an Overwatch killer, success is the death of Overwatch. The reason this is a problem is that this is imposing a pretty impossible standard. Like I said earlier, Overwatch is probably realistically too big to just be killed stone dead at this point, especially by an external force. It's the common touchstone used to describe team-based objective-focused hero shooters if you're looking for some shorthand. It's like Overwatch but X is a valid, understandable way to explain a game to people. The total complete death of Overwatch probably isn't going to happen, at least not anytime soon. But when people internalize that as the marker for success of a competitor, it ironically serves to make it impossible for them to succeed. They're not necessarily doing this cynically either. They may genuinely believe that a good hero shooter will kill Overwatch, and if it fails to do so, they'll interpret that as proof that it might not be a very good hero shooter at all. Or it must not be. After all, Overwatch sucks. Anything could beat it. So if this can't, what's that say about the game? Again, a king can bleed, but a god can't. A competitor, even a dominant one, is successful if it can manage to stay afloat against strong competition and make a name for itself. But a killer is only successful if it kills. And again, while some of this is just hater behavior, a surprising amount of it is not. A lot of people want Overwatch dead not because they're just like throwing tomatoes from the outside, they don't just want to see it fail for the sake of it failing despite having no investment in it. They want it to die because they feel stuck with Overwatch and are looking for something to kill it so that they can be free. They feel addicted to this game, trapped in it because they don't know where else to go or what else to play, and they want it to die so that they can finally be unchained. They can't stop themselves from coming back to it because it's become a force of habit at this point, and they want someone else to free them from the anchor that's holding them here. There are some people who generally fall under the title of haters now, but weren't to start with, who I would say see it more like one of those post-Soviet Eastern European leaders who came to power after the collapse of the USSR on the promise of ending corruption and bringing democracy to the people, only to then become dictators in their own right, i.e. Lukashenko. These people haven't been lifelong haters of Blizzard or Overwatch. Most of these people in this camp were probably either neutral or fans of it in the past who felt like, for any number of reasons, it had lost its way and needs to be put down before it continues to make things worse. And to some degree, I can see the argument that those people are making. Whenever a game gets big, it gets to set market trends. Whenever a developer or a publisher is able to corner a market, they'll usually start tightening the screws in terms of monetization, time, and more. If you see Overwatch as having gotten to that point where it has that kind of dominance where it can set the narrative, and you think it's not doing a good job of that, or it's making things actively worse, you might be arguing for the death of Overwatch and advocating for its ostensible killers because you genuinely believe the industry is worse off for Overwatch's dominance and needs to be freed. To me, all of these views help to explain why people are actively seeking out an Overwatch killer. This isn't like a Sim City Skyline situation where Overwatch solidly nuked itself into the ground, is unquestionably dead, and everyone's just looking for a new game to take up the mantle. People have given up hope that Overwatch is either going to get better or die trying, so they're trying to find a champion that can actively kill it for them. And unfortunately for them, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, this is having the opposite effect that you think it is. Part 3. Ceci, Tuera, Cela. Throughout this video, I've talked about Notre Dame de Paris and that famous quote from the novel that is now the title of this section. Ceci, Tuera, Cela. This will kill that, the novel will kill the edifice. A lot of this video has assumed that Hugo's framing was correct, that the printing press did kill architecture. But I would argue that Hugo is wrong, or at least it's more complicated than that. I mean, obviously, this video does not have the time to get into a full deep dive into the specific nature of architecture in our society, but we'll try and be brief here, okay? His specific novel played a huge role in saving the building in question. And not just that one either. The conservation of historical buildings feels like something we just naturally do nowadays, but that was very much so not always the case. Notre Dame itself had fallen into pretty significant disrepair at the time because it was France in the 19th century and they were occupied with a lot at the time. But Notre Dame de Paris motivated the people to take up the preservation of Notre Dame, the conservation of Notre Dame that we still see today with how many people mobilized to fundraise after a big part of it burned down. On a broader level, architectural preservation became a bigger part of how we preserve our culture and our history, and at the time even contributed to a Gothic revival in architecture. Now, that's not to say nothing changed. Architecture's role in our society today is different than it was back then, and the printing press and the technologies that followed it did play a pretty big role in that. There's also societal changes, Literacy rates are just much higher now. Standardized education is much more common. It's not that inaccessible to put things in writing the way it once was. However, the automobile could never make the case for the horse. The novel could and did make the case for architecture, the same way that a TV show can make the case for film, or a video game can make the case for a tabletop game, or a YouTube video can make the case for novels or poems or architecture. One of the crucial things to understand about communication is that it's complicated. How we perceive each other as a result of the technologies we have, whether it's alphabets or printing presses. The way we perceive time and distance was immutably, irreparably changed by the existence of a global mail delivery system. The size of our world never was the same again. And it changed again with the invention of the telegram. It was changed again by the invention of the telephone, and it was changed again by the invention of the internet, and it will undoubtedly continue to be changed with more future technology that we can't even think of right now. But while some developments in communication technology do kill their predecessors, like the telephone kind of did to the telegram, others, particularly those capable of telling stories, won't necessarily do the same. The act of writing Notre Dame de Paris was the use of the printing press as a tool to protect, preserve, and explain the importance of architecture through the vehicle of the technology that was being accused of killing it. Modern architecture might not seem to us like it has a hope in hell of competing with Notre Dame, but it's worth remembering, for one, Notre Dame is pretty singular in terms of its prominence and its stature and what it was. There weren't a lot of Notre Dames in the past. And it's also worth remembering that a lot of people took Notre Dame for granted throughout the centuries too, in large part because it was just a fact of life for them. It was just a building that was there. And when we compare modern architecture to that, it's worth remembering that future generations won't be looking at it as the buildings that they've lived beside forever necessarily. They'll be looking at it as the things that we built today. That'll change things. I mean, the Edmonton Public Library is certainly one of the buildings of all time, no doubt, but it does say something about the culture that built it. Namely, that apparently the people of Edmonton really wanted to read books inside of a tank. By contrast to that, the Calgary Public Library and the Calgary Peace Bridge are genuinely very beautiful pieces of architecture that do say something about us. They still tell us something about what we are as a people, what was prioritized, and I'm sure people in the future will eventually draw meaning about us from them too. It's also important to mention that when we talk about, governments funding big, expensive architectural projects, a lot of people get really mad about their tax dollars being wasted on something that isn't purely utilitarian, but then they also get mad that their buildings are ugly. There is kind of a no-win situation here, and people don't seem to be willing to agree on what to actually do. However, that's not really the point. The point throughout a lot of this has been to point out how the idea of the Overwatch killer is a myth, or more accurately, a self-defeating narrative. Notre Dame de Paris was a novel lamenting the tragedy of the loss of architecture as a common language and as a cultural touchstone that highlighted how its presence throughout the centuries had had a profound impact on the people who surrounded it. And through that, it had the effect of preserving Notre Dame. It didn't reverse the impact of the printing press, it didn't return France to the Renaissance, and it didn't fix some of the damage that was done, because some of it was irreparable. But it did change how we perceived architecture and how to use it to communicate even after it stopped needing to serve that purpose. The Capitol Building's dome in Washington, D.C. features a piece titled The Apotheosis of Washington from 1865 that serves a similar purpose, even invoking religious iconography akin to religious architecture of the past to try and communicate a story or an ideal of America. The piece features Washington effectively framed as a god surrounded by mythical figures representing 6 national concepts of war, science, marine, commerce, mechanics, and agriculture. That is a usage of architecture to tell a story. And people read into that. People have learned from that. BioShock Infinite pulls a lot of inspiration from that exact concept, that melding of the founding of America with religious symbolism. Canada's Parliament buildings, by contrast, were built in the late 1800s in the Gothic revival style that Hugo's work had contributed to, and much of the architecture is meant to communicate the Canadian government's story, as it were, to the public. The ceiling of the House of Commons foyer is made of stained glass panels, with the larger panels combining the English Tudor rose with the French fleur-de-lis, and the smaller ones portraying different ministries of the government. In doing so, it communicates not only the heritage of Canada, but what this building is for, what they're doing here. Another stained glass window that was in the Senate foyer prior to ongoing renovations featured Queen Elizabeth II and Queen Victoria commemorating their Diamond Jubilees, 60 years each on the throne, with their respective versions of the centre block of Parliament being featured. The effect of these is basically to turn the Canadian Parliament into a bit of a picture book. The renovations that I mentioned were, in their own way, the necessary result of the same kind of neglect that had damaged Notre Dame over the years. Crumbling masonry, leaky pipes, insufficient electrical infrastructure, and more had been left to worsen over years by people who took it for granted, and at times suggested just tearing it all down and trying again with a regular modern office building. But instead, they committed a lot of money in the early 2000s to a careful renovation and restoration project that would try and preserve or recreate all the artifacts and architectural decisions of the past. Some parts of the renovations are done, some buildings are completed, but Centre Block, where the House of Commons and the Senate are supposed to sit, have had their renovations going on for 6 years now, and they're likely to continue well into the 2030s at this point. But again, this architecture is literally environmental storytelling. You can learn about how Canada views its provinces by seeing what rooms feature provincial art or symbolism and how it tries to balance them. Or how it doesn't. You can see how Canada views its heritage, French, English, Indigenous, and the immigrants who make up the country who are often excluded from this stuff through who is or is not featured throughout the architecture and where it happens. You can even see it in the style itself. The Gothic Revival style didn't spring from nowhere, it reflects European trends specifically. And it reflects how there is a concentrated effort right now towards historical conservation when it comes to protecting that style. And this doesn't happen everywhere. Modern political institutions like the United Nations and the European Union tend to avoid those classical styles in favor of modern architecture that's meant to look not just new and separate from the past, but also a bit more culturally agnostic rather than aesthetically leaning towards a specific historical culture. Not that that's like possible, obviously every building is still going to reflect something about the people who built it, but in general they're a lot more neutral than doing like Gothic architecture for the UN headquarters. Some countries choose buildings with historical architecture that reflect their history, like France or the UK, for their government buildings, whereas others, like Germany, will use historical architecture but deliberately add modern elements like a giant glass dome to try and find the middle ground between embracing history, but not looking like you're embracing history too much. And for Germany, probably a good call. You want to maybe change the silhouette of that particular building. Other countries still lean modern. Brazil's Palácio do Congresso Nacional, which again, apologies for the butchering. Sorry, Brazil. I mean, they're not going to get mad at me on Twitter anymore, so I guess I'm fine. Anyways, the palace is built in the unique Brazilian modern style, while Australia's Parliament House is a really fascinating building that incorporates modern architecture but blends it more directly with landscaping, and is built to communicate subservience to the people specifically rather than imposing dominance on them. The building itself is relatively wide and flat, and is meant to look like it's been built into a hill rather than on top of one like Canada's, and the Australian people are able to walk on top of their parliament as a result. Something Wikipedia says is meant to symbolize that the people are literally above their government. But not above their country, though. The largest flag in Australia flies on a massive flagpole above the building, which extends the symbolism further. The government serves the people, but the country is something above them both, something bigger than any individual Australian or political squabble. Architecture doesn't just exist in the building itself either, it's also used as a symbol of national identity through currency. Each Canadian bill in the Frontier series, which is the one before the current one, but the current one is mostly not out yet. Anyways, each bill in that series incorporates a different part of the Parliament buildings, with the West Block on the $5 bill, the Library of Parliament on the 10, Peace Tower on the 20, Centre Block on the 50, and East Block on the 100. The new series of bills, the Vertical series, only has a $10 version so far, thanks Queen Elizabeth for dying, I guess, and while the library's ceiling is still incorporated into that design, the design more prominently features the modern architecture of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. This, combined with the black civil rights activist Viola Desmond becoming the first time the featured portrait was neither a monarch nor a prime minister, says something too. Explicitly communicating a more modern, different Canada that's trying to find a new identity, not just one that valorizes the past. In the US, the $5, $10, $20, $50, and $100 bills also all feature architecture. But of course, it's not Gothic Revival or modern. The $5 bill is the Lincoln Memorial, the 10 is the Treasury Building, 20 is the White House, 50 is the Capitol Building, and 100 is Independence Hall. And all of those, except for Independence Hall, are built in a style of neoclassical architecture, specifically Greek Revival. And you might think it's a bit odd that America has so many important buildings that are Greek-inspired. Greece didn't found America, Greece didn't settle the continent. But it also wasn't accidental that Greek Revival was the style chosen for a lot of these buildings. At the time, America was a young, slave-owning democratic republic, and there were aspects of that Greek tradition that appealed to both the North and the South. To the North, the style represented and symbolized the democratic principles that would bring them glory, that would found their new country, that would lead them on to a brilliant future. And in the South, the style symbolized the riches, prosperity, and also glory that slavery brought to a nation. Part of the challenge of architecture is that because it's not quite as black and white as literal text, people can read into it a lot of different things, especially if they want to read into it very different things. When it comes to Hugo's Notre Dame de Paris, this sort of thing, maintaining at least the spirit of architecture's role as a communication tool that anyone could access, divorced from the need for literacy, was probably the best he could hope for. The printing press wasn't going to go away, but the fact that so many government buildings in particular maintain these principles of architectural communication says something about what information we now consider so essential that it needs to be communicated to the public the same way that religious scriptures were in centuries past. Call these buildings the poor man's social studies textbook, I guess. Not every building is like this, but Hugo wasn't trying to argue for every building to be treated like this either. That's why it wasn't about a hypothetical old building and just making the argument for old buildings in general. It was about a real one. Taking a tangible structure and making it an active part of people's lives changes their relationship to it, whether that's in the form of a novel set in the building or currency that prominently features it. The problem with the myth of the Overwatch killer is that, by centering Overwatch in the narrative the same way that Hugo centered Notre Dame, it has the same effect. The novel can't kill the edifice if the novel immortalizes the edifice. And so too does the Overwatch killer narrative immortalize Overwatch. Part 4. Memento Mori? Nah. Volens Vivificans. Sue me for trying to be cultured, I guess. I read books. I'm educated.
So none of us read books? Is that what you're trying to say? None of us are educated because you went to school and you keep talking about you going to school. I went to school too.
I don't read. Anyways, that's really the point of all of this. When you center a subject in your discussions, you are implicitly keeping it alive. There are other Gothic cathedrals in Europe, but Notre Dame is probably the one you're most likely to know of. It's the one you probably want to go visit if you had to pick one in France. But why? Because that was the center of discussion when it came to architectural preservation and conservation. Hugo's work has survived nearly 200 years, being adapted to stage plays, other novels, movies, and more. Most of you probably know it from Disney's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, like that's where I know it from, and that was the effect of Hugo's work. Is it maybe necessarily presented exactly how he initially intended it to, his artistic, authorial intent being respected? Maybe not, but also, it seems like he maybe kind of wanted this. The goal was to preserve the building. And if The Hunchback of Notre Dame, if Disney is keeping it alive, I think he'd probably prioritize that, honestly. The title of this section is Latin for Remember to Die? Nah. Willing death, giving life. The first bit, Memento Mori, is a famous expression about remembering that everyone dies. The second bit, Volens Vivificans, is Google Translate. Apologies if my grammar sucks. I don't think that's a real expression, but I couldn't find one that used vivier as like a good way of communicating that intention, and I wanted to use one that at least a little bit connected to my namesake. Then again, odds are that you don't speak Latin, so you don't know if my grammar sucks or if my translation is correct because Latin's a dead language. You know, very few people reading this probably speak it fluently. It's not like Spanish or French where people definitely can tell I'm saying shit wrong, or Portuguese. Again, so sorry to Brazil. I promise I don't mean it. And yet, despite it being a dead language, it's been preserved and protected, and we use it a lot for something that's supposed to be dead. Memento Mori, de facto, de jure, actus reus, mens rea, mea culpa, habeas corpus, corpus delicti. Delicti? I don't know. Pax Britannica, Semper Fi, Vox Populi, like the list goes on and on here. They're not necessarily all common in terms of like you'd use them day to day, but like they're all terms that could have pretty easily been translated and just used in English or whatever other language you speak. You know, remember to die, the actual state of affairs, the legal state of affairs, the guilty act, the guilty mind, through my fault, produce the body of the crime, the British peace, always faithful or loyal, the voice of the people, etc. Like these aren't impossible concepts to capture in other languages. And yet we preserve them in Latin. Did the emergence and dominance of the Germanic, Slavic, and Romance languages over the centuries kill Latin? Well, as a common language, yeah. But it's still preserved in everything from Latin masses, Latin idioms, Latin legal terminology, and Latin classes if you're unfortunate enough to be British. Describing every hero shooter that comes out as an Overwatch killer paradoxically guarantees that none of them can be because you are embedding Overwatch into it. City Skylines could safely be called a SimCity killer because SimCity was already dead, and City Skylines wasn't being positioned against its active ongoing existence. There was no way for SimCity to continue existing, at least at the time, so discussing it didn't change that aside from maybe making sure it couldn't come back. But Overwatch isn't like that. It doesn't just hold cultural dominance, it doesn't just survive, it survives because it currently holds cultural dominance. It's embedded in how these things are, it's embedded in the culture of gaming. It survives because it has become the shorthand for objective-based, team-focused hero shooters or whatever it was I said earlier. It survives because every potential competitor it has is described explicitly through its relationship to Overwatch. It's Marvel's Overwatch, or it's Valve's Overwatch, or it's Overwatch meets League of Legends, or it's Overwatch meets Fortnite, or it's whatever else, but it's always being tied back to Overwatch. Overwatch lives because this narrative inherently requires it to. Now, you might be elderly like me and remember 2014 to 2016. You might remember even some people describing Overwatch as a Team Fortress 2 killer and argue that that didn't stop Overwatch from eating TF2's lunch. TF2 today is not what it once was, and it doesn't hold the same cultural cachet that it once did, and Overwatch did undoubtedly play a big role in that. Like, it kinda couldn't avoid doing that. But the difference is that Overwatch's rollout wasn't just being dominated by this is Blizzard's TF2 or this is the TF2 killer. It's not that Overwatch wasn't discussed at all in the context of TF2. It was compared to it. The similarities were noted, the differences were noted, and its capacity to hurt TF2 was discussed, but none of that was the center of the discussion. And ironically, it's probably honestly in large part because people didn't really hate TF2 in 2016 as much as they hate Overwatch in 2024. There was less of a mainstream desire for a TF2 killer because even though plenty of people had burned out on it or disliked it or wanted to change or just wanted, Valve to stop neglecting it, it wasn't nearly as much of a mainstream cultural juggernaut like Overwatch has been. There's no shade to TF2. I had fun with it too. I'm not saying that it was a bad game or that it never had any sort of significance, but your mom had a better chance of knowing who Tracer was during Overwatch's golden years than she did of knowing who the Heavy was during TF2's. Overwatch was compared to its contemporaries, sure, but it wasn't treated like it needed to kill TF2 or any other one or else it was a failure. And incidentally, it did still kill a lot of contemporaries over its lifetime. Battleborn is the most obvious one. It came out right around the same time as Overwatch, which has absolutely gone down as a top 10 terrible business decision in gaming. Overwatch pretty unquestionably won the war and killed it stone dead. but Battleborn never really had a chance before it died, and it also came out when hype for Overwatch was really big, when it was entering a really good period. In contrast, you could also say that Overwatch killed Concord in the same kind of way, even at a bit of a down point. Although that implies that anyone actually knew Concord existed or did anything deliberate to kill it. I mean, aside from Sony. If we're being real here, the closest equivalent that can be drawn with Concord is someone in an SUV splattering a mosquito. Totally unintentional, nobody's gonna care enough to blame you for it, and there's a very real chance that they wouldn't have even noticed if the splatter hadn't been so big. However, whether we're talking about the old guard of TF2, the contemporary at the time of Battleborn, or the attempted newcomer of Concord, Overwatch didn't have to kill any of them. It didn't carry a title of killer. It carried a title of competitor, sure, but not killer. Like I said, there were people who discussed Overwatch as a TF2 killer. But even for those people, the narrative really wasn't like, TF2 is cooked, it's so over, out of a desire for TF2 to be cooked. Where that sentiment existed, it was more along the lines of like, uh-oh, TF2 might be fucked, this looks like this might clean them out. At the time, Overwatch didn't inherently need to kill TF2 in order for it to be seen as a success. It was going to be allowed to survive alongside it and still not be seen as a failure. If TF2 had managed to hold pace, it might have been seen as a bit weird for Overwatch. It might have been seen as Overwatch maybe fumbling the bag a little bit. Revelatory concept for Overwatch fumbling the bag, I know, but it wouldn't be seen as a failure of Overwatch if TF2 survived. Same probably would run for Battleborn. If Battleborn had managed to survive and hold its own and be, a fair competitor, again, probably would have seemed a bit weird to some people who thought that Overwatch might have killed it outright, but it wouldn't be a failure as a result. In the modern day, the same deal applies. If Concord had survived, somehow, Overwatch wouldn't necessarily be seen as a failure as a result. The point I'm trying to make is that Overwatch is not perceived as needing to kill to succeed. Its survival is enough for it to be considered successful by the people who are talking about its death, whether you think that Overwatch succeeding is a good or bad thing. And this isn't the case with how people are discussing Deadlock or Marvel Rivals, which I think it's fair to say are the ones that are really currently being held up as Overwatch killers. Rivals is definitely the more similar of the two to Overwatch, and Deadlock is actually pretty different, but when you need to hammer a nail, you'll start getting desperate for anything even vaguely resembling a hammer. The comparisons to Overwatch, the way they'll impact Overwatch, what they bring to the table that Overwatch doesn't, what they don't bring to the table that Overwatch does, all of that still centers Overwatch in the discussion. When people are talking about the kits of heroes in Marvel Rivals and they're like, oh, this seems like Lucio, this seems like Mercy, this seems like that is centering Overwatch. And this problem is exacerbated by the fact that Overwatch is pretty clearly and pretty indisputably the top dog of its niche right now. Again, not that everyone likes that or wants it to be that way or even thinks that that's fair, but facts are facts. Nobody is calling Deadlock Valve's attempt at Paladins, or even their attempt at taking another crack at TF2. An Overwatch killer doesn't just have to shoulder check a rival into the glass like Overwatch did to Battleborn or survive the challenges like Overwatch does now. An Overwatch killer has to coup the king. And that's another problem with centering Overwatch in this narrative while it's still on top. A coup d'etat relies on the element of surprise. It is hard to pull off a coup d'etat when everyone is constantly pointing at one guy and being like, oh my god, you guys, this one's the one who's going to do it. This is the one who's going to kill the king. In fact, if your goal is to sabotage a coup, the most effective way to do that is to just expose who's involved. It not only allows a king to identify the threat and why they're a threat, but it also highlights the relationship between them as being between a king and a failed challenger. The dominant power, perhaps even the benevolent power, versus the backstabbing rat who had to try and play dirty to win. Now, did the king maybe play a little dirty to get the throne too? Maybe. Who's to say? But Overwatch didn't get to where it got by relying on being a TF2 killer. It didn't rely on that narrative. It played clean in the sense that the coup, if there was one, was carried out relatively innocuously. Valve knew that Overwatch was coming, but if the narrative had been, hey guys, look at this super cool upcoming new game, I bet it'll finally knock TF2 off its throne, that's my only priority, is whether or not this kills TF2, then it would invite people to play TF2, to try it out, and to compare Overwatch in its beta state to TF2 at a point where it was nearly as old as Overwatch is today. Overwatch's narrative in the public consciousness, not like its story, but like, how people perceived it, all of that stood largely on its own. And if it was a TF2 killer, it was at least in part because TF2 ended up being seen as so irrelevant in comparison to Overwatch at the time, or at least as time went on, that it felt silly to have the discussion for the same reason that it would be silly to call Overwatch a Concord killer. No true Overwatch killer can hold the title of Overwatch killer if it is to succeed at that goal, or even just to succeed at all. It sets the game slapped with that label up for failure by defining their success by the metric of Overwatch's failure, and it makes it impossible for Overwatch to truly die because the Overwatch killer narrative is keeping it alive. And subconsciously, I think there are a lot of people who know that. The people who feel trapped in Overwatch also feel a little bit safe in Overwatch. By this point, millions of people have spent close to a decade playing it. As much as they might wish it was gone, there's also fear there. What comes after Overwatch if it dies? The people who left and wish it would die so something better could emerge are also going to be wary of what might come next. Even if you think that Overwatch's dominance or Blizzard's power in the industry is harmful to gaming, and I think that's a pretty fair argument to make, you also have to recognize that it's possible that whatever kills it might be worse. And the haters don't want it to die because then they'll lose their cash cow. Overwatch to them is a reliable punching bag that shoots out money and popularity and engagement when you hit it. If we're being really real here, if we're keeping it $1.50, the outright haters are probably the ones who want it to survive more than anybody else. If Overwatch died tomorrow, those people would be the ones who have to find new ways to pay the bills, to farm engagement, and to make a name for themselves. Overwatch killers are a myth. At least right now. Maybe someday some game can be retroactively defined as an Overwatch killer if it dies, but if Overwatch is going to die, it is probably going to go out the way Halo did. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. Never truly gone, but maybe one day diminished after a slow fade from its position of cultural dominance. Banging the war drum against Overwatch ensures it can't go out with a whimper, that it will survive another day. The day Overwatch dies is the day that no one cares to talk about it. The day that an objective-based, team-based hero shooter can be released without the narrative being, but what does this say about the future of Overwatch? The day a new hero comes out and nobody really cares to even make fan art. The day a new season begins and no one cares to criticize how it's monetized. The day that Overwatch 4 is announced and most people's reaction is, wait, there is an Overwatch 3? The day that another big news story comes out about Blizzard, and it isn't on anyone's trending page because no one cares. Ceci, Tuera, Cela. This will not kill that, because that relies on this to survive. This video, in that sense, plays its own role in keeping Overwatch alive, as does your engagement with it. Algorithms will identify your interest in Overwatch and are going to do their best to loop you in and keep you there. Discourse on Twitter, discourse on YouTube, discourse anywhere. It's going to try and wrap you in because it thinks that you care. And if really any amount of brainpower is spent thinking about the death of Overwatch, then they're not wrong. If you truly believe Overwatch needs to die, if you truly believe it needs to happen, then the only thing to do is to kill the Overwatch that lives in your own mind. Stop proclaiming everything even remotely similar to it to be the man that would be king. If you're making room for Overwatch to live rent-free in your brain and on your YouTube feed and on your Twitter feed and on your Twitch feed, then you are making room for it to live, and it has a place to stay. The Overwatch killer is a myth because the true Overwatch killer is quite literally nothing. It is not the presence of a singular game, or video, or tweet, or article that will destroy it, but the absence of any of those things from anyone who gives a shit about Overwatch that'll truly mark its death. And on that cheerful note, that's where I'm going to end this one. Thank you very much for watching, and if you've enjoyed this, be sure to like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the future videos. The next one is hopefully going to be a shorter one discussing the Pinkertons in gaming and how history gets rewritten, but I mean, given how I managed to go off on a tangent in every video, shorter might be relative here. And the one after that should be the September Members' Choice video, Cyberpunk 2077, and the importance of understanding your genre. I'm also hoping to get one more video out on October 4th, which is coincidentally my 2-year anniversary as a content creator. I'll be starting a donathon over on Twitch at twitch.tv/theviveros on that same day to celebrate, so be sure to keep an eye out over the next few weeks on Twitter and the community posts where I'll share rewards and incentives for that. For people who've been here before, a lot of those rewards are going to be familiar, but for people who aren't, there are things like bonus videos, extra members' choice videos, top donor gets to pick a video topic, stuff like that. So I'll hopefully be kept busy for the rest of 2024 filling out those rewards. Lastly, thank you to all my channel members. Minnie Q, Olesp, Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Nemo Survivor, Dextiny, Yoshi of the Wire, CatLover192, Cadence, Windex the Great, V, Deleathers, Gavost, Marsh Alice, Crimson Cyclo, Good Guy Luis, Corey, Hallucigeno, MV, The Only Enigma, Hazmat Baddick Games, Mariah, Amon Dadley, and Rendell. Whether you're a member, a subscriber, or you just clicked on this video out of curiosity, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.